A poor boy saves a millionaire's mother, but he is unfairly accused, and what happens next will leave you speechless. Hello, welcome. Enjoy, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It was a hot, tense afternoon in San Isidro, a village where hope seemed as fragile as the wooden and clay houses scattered across the landscape. The sky was heavy with thick clouds, promising an imminent storm, while the river winding through the village swelled with the first drops of rain. Matthew, a young man with determined eyes and hands hardened by labor, was near the riverbank, gathering branches and logs carried by the current. He knew the storm could flood his home, and every piece of wood was vital to reinforce the barely standing roof. Suddenly, a sharp scream pierced the air. A woman's voice, filled with desperation, instantly caught his attention. Dropping everything, he ran to the edge of the river. That's when he saw her, a woman being carried away by the current. Her fine clothes and blonde hair stood out against the humble surroundings, and even amidst the chaos, it was clear she didn't belong there. Without hesitation, Matthew plunged into the muddy, churning waters. The river seemed intent on swallowing him as well, but he fought against the current with fierce determination. His arms cut through the water with effort, each stroke pulling strength from muscles already exhausted by his daily toil. When he finally reached the woman, she was weak, barely able to respond. Their eyes met briefly, and in that fleeting moment, something unspoken passed between them. With superhuman effort, Matthew managed to drag her back to the shore. As they reached solid ground, he collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. The woman coughed and trembled, but she was alive. A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Isabel, still trying to catch her breath, noticed the curious and suspicious faces closing in around them. A middle-aged woman, draping a shawl over her shoulders, suddenly noticed something unusual. "Your necklace. It's gone," the woman said. Isabel instinctively reached for her neck, her fingers brushing the empty space where her necklace should have been. Her eyes widened, but she was still too dazed to react. The mere mention of its absence was enough to spark murmurs among the crowd. It was him, a man in the crowd accused, pointing at Matthew. Who else could it be? Matthew, still kneeling in the mud, raised his head slowly, meeting the man's gaze. His breathing was labored, but he understood immediately what was happening. His eyes shifted to Isabel, silently pleading for her to speak up, to deny the absurd accusation. But Isabel said nothing. Still shaken and overwhelmed by fear, she couldn't summon the strength to defend him. Her hands trembled, and she avoided his gaze. "No one risks their life for free," someone else muttered, and the comment rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Matthew felt the weight of their words and Isabel's silence like a crushing blow. He stood up slowly, his soaked clothes clinging to his body and mud sticking to his feet, but he kept his head high. "I didn't steal anything," he said, his voice steady but quiet. The rain began to fall, first as light droplets, then quickly turning into a downpour. The crowd grew silent as Matthew glanced at Isabel one last time, his eyes filled with a deep sadness, before turning and walking away. His heavy footsteps sank into the mud, each step echoing like a silent protest against the injustice. Isabel, still sitting by the riverbank, watched him leave. Deep down, she knew he had done nothing wrong. But the pressure of the crowd, the fear of confronting their accusations, and the emotional paralysis of the moment had kept her from speaking. As raindrops mixed with her tears, Isabel realized that silence, in that moment, was one of the cruelest forms of injustice. The rain continued to fall, soaking the earth and masking the tears that streaked Isabel's face. As Matthew disappeared into the distance, the crowd slowly dispersed, their murmurs fading into the sound of the storm. Isabel sat alone by the riverbank, the chill of the rain sinking into her skin, but she didn't move. Her heart was heavy with guilt, each beat a reminder of her failure to speak up. Back in his small, weathered house, Matthew found his family gathered around a modest meal of bread and soup. His younger siblings, Sarah and Daniel, rushed to him, their faces lighting up despite his drenched and tired appearance. "Matthew! You're home!" Sarah exclaimed, her voice filled with innocence and joy. Daniel noticed the somber look in his brother's eyes and the way he carried himself, shoulders heavy with an invisible weight. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice quieter. Matthew managed a small smile, ruffling Daniel's hair. "I'm fine," he said, though the words felt hollow. Their mother, Elena, looked up from the stove where she was stirring the soup. Her eyes, lined with the exhaustion of years of hardship, narrowed slightly as she studied her son. She didn't ask questions immediately. Instead, she handed him a dry towel and motioned for him to sit. As the family ate, Elena broke the silence. "Something happened," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I can see it in your eyes." Matthew hesitated, glancing at his siblings, who were listening intently. He didn't want to worry them, but his mother's steady gaze told him she wouldn't let the matter drop. "I saved someone," he began, his voice measured. "A woman from the river. But things didn't go as they should have." Elena set her spoon down, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "They accused me of stealing from her," Matthew said quietly, his gaze fixed on the table. "Her necklace was missing, and they all assumed it was me." Sarah gasped, her small hands covering her mouth, while Daniel's face flushed with anger. "That's not fair," he exclaimed. "You'd never do something like that." Elena's expression darkened, but her voice remained steady. "And this woman? Did she defend you?" Matthew shook his head, the memory of Isabel's silence cutting deeper than the accusations. "No. She didn't say anything." For a moment, the room was silent except for the sound of rain pattering against the roof. Then Elena reached across the table, placing her hand over Matthew's. "Listen to me, my son. The truth always comes out. It may not be today or tomorrow, but it will. Until then, we hold our heads high and continue living with honor." Matthew nodded, though the sting of the day's events lingered. He found comfort in his family's unwavering belief in him, but doubt and frustration began to settle in his heart. Meanwhile, at the grand estate on the hill, Isabel stood by her bedroom window, watching the storm outside. The warmth of the room, with its crackling fire and opulent furnishings, felt suffocating compared to the raw, unfiltered emotions she had experienced by the river. Her maid, Rosa, entered the room quietly, carrying a tray of tea. "Señorita Isabel, you should rest. You've had a terrible shock." Isabel turned, her face pale but composed. "I can't stop thinking about him, Rosa," she admitted. "The boy who saved me." Rosa hesitated, setting the tray down. "He was very brave," she said carefully, "but the people, they don't trust him." "That doesn't matter," Isabel said sharply, her voice trembling. "He saved my life. And I let them," she paused, her chest tightening. "I let them treat him like a criminal." Rosa's expression softened. "Sometimes fear makes us do things we regret, señorita. But regrets won't fix anything." Isabel looked back out the window, her reflection merging with the stormy night. "I need to make this right," she whispered, more to herself than to Rosa. The night wore on, but for both Matthew and Isabel, sleep was elusive. Each was haunted by the day's events, one by injustice, the other by guilt. For Matthew, the weight of the accusations threatened to break the resolve he had spent his life building. For Isabel, the storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest of remorse raging within her. And though they didn't know it yet, this was only the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. The next morning, Matthew woke early, the sky still heavy with the remnants of the storm. The house was quiet except for the faint sound of his mother humming in the kitchen as she prepared breakfast. He rose, determined to push the events of the previous day to the back of his mind. There was work to be done, and dwelling on injustice wouldn't put food on the table. Outside, the ground was damp and muddy, the air thick with the scent of wet earth. Matthew set off toward the village square to look for day labor, his boots squelching in the muck. He noticed a few familiar faces as he passed, their expressions wary or outright dismissive. Whispers followed him, but he kept his head high, ignoring the sting of their judgment. Near the bustling market, he found work unloading crates of produce from a cart. The pay was meager, but it was enough to buy a small bag of flour for his family. As he worked, he couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversation. "Did you hear? The lady from the mansion is looking for someone. Probably wants to get her necklace back. After what happened, who would dare show up there?" The words fueled his frustration, but Matthew kept his focus on the crates. He wouldn't let the gossip consume him. At the same time, high above the village in her family's sprawling estate, Isabel stood in the grand dining room, facing her father. He was a commanding figure with sharp eyes that always seemed to see through her, and today was no exception. "You're distracted," he said, cutting into his breakfast. "What's on your mind?" Isabel hesitated, her fingers twisting the napkin in her lap. "It's about the boy who saved me yesterday." Her father arched an eyebrow but said nothing, prompting her to continue. "They accused him of stealing," she said, her voice faltering. "And I didn't defend him. He risked his life for me, and I said nothing." Her father set down his fork, leaning back in his chair. "Isabel, you're young, but you must understand something about the world. People like him, those who come from nothing, are often desperate. Desperation leads to poor decisions." Her stomach churned at his words. "You think he stole from me?" "I think it's possible," he replied coolly. "And even if he didn't, his kind has no place mixing with ours. Leave it alone, Isabel. It's better that way." Isabel's heart sank, but she didn't argue further. She knew her father wouldn't change his mind. Still, his words only strengthened her resolve to do something. Later that day, as the sun began to peek through the clouds, Isabel slipped out of the estate with Rosa at her side. She clutched a small pouch filled with coins, her pulse quickening as they descended into the village. "Are you sure about this, señorita?" Rosa asked, glancing nervously at the bustling streets below. "I need to speak to him," Isabel said firmly. "I need to thank him properly, and apologize." They reached the market square, where Isabel's presence immediately drew attention. Her fine clothes and delicate features stood out like a beacon among the simple villagers. People whispered as she passed, their eyes darting between her and Rosa. It wasn't long before she spotted Matthew, his back bent under the weight of a crate. She hesitated for a moment, her nerves threatening to overwhelm her, but then she called out, "Matthew!" He froze, his grip tightening on the crate. Slowly, he turned, his face unreadable as he saw her approaching. "I need to speak with you," Isabel said, her voice steady despite the stares of those around them. Matthew set the crate down, wiping his hands on his trousers. "What for?" he asked, his tone cautious. "To thank you," she said, stepping closer. "And to make things right." Her words hung in the air, drawing the attention of nearby villagers. Matthew glanced at the growing crowd, his jaw tightening. "There's nothing to make right," he said, his voice clipped. "What's done is done." "But it isn't," Isabel insisted, lowering her voice. "You saved my life, and I repaid you with silence. That was wrong, and I'm sorry." Matthew studied her for a long moment, his expression hard. "Apologies don't change what people think of me. Or what I've had to endure because of it." Her face flushed, but she didn't back down. "Then let me help you. Please. I brought this." She held out the pouch of coins, but Matthew's hand shot up, stopping her. "I don't need your charity," he said sharply. The crowd murmured, and Isabel felt their judgment turning toward her now. Rosa touched her arm gently, urging her to leave, but Isabel stayed rooted in place. "This isn't charity," she said softly. "It's gratitude." Matthew's expression softened slightly, but he shook his head. If you're truly sorry, then prove it. Show them I'm not what they think I am. Isabel's breath caught in her throat as she realized what he was asking of her. It wasn't money or favors he wanted, it was her voice, her influence. I will, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. I'll prove it. Matthew nodded once before turning back to his work, leaving Isabel standing in the square, her resolve burning brighter than ever. That evening, Isabel returned to the estate with her thoughts spinning. The confrontation with Matthew had been far from what she expected. She had hoped her apology and the offer of money would bring him some relief, but instead, his words had struck a nerve. If you're truly sorry, then prove it. The weight of those words sat heavy on her chest as she paced her room, her skirts rustling against the floor. Proving his innocence would mean more than just defending him, it would mean standing against the assumptions of her father, the villagers, and everyone else who had judged him so easily. Meanwhile, Matthew finished his work for the day, his body aching from the labor. As he walked back home, the lingering tension from his encounter with Isabel simmered inside him. He didn't want to feel bitterness toward her, but her silence during the accusations had cut deep. Still, there was something in her voice earlier that seemed genuine. At the small house, his family waited for him, their simple dinner ready on the table. His siblings greeted him eagerly, their laughter momentarily lifting the weight on his shoulders. Matthew, his mother said after dinner, her voice low as the children played nearby. I heard she came to see you today. He nodded, his expression guarded. She apologized. Elena's eyes softened, but she didn't smile. And do you believe her? I don't know, he admitted. She says she wants to make it right, but words don't erase what's already been done. Elena reached for his hand, her grip firm and comforting. People can surprise you, my son. Sometimes, even those who seem blind to the truth find a way to see it. The next morning, Isabel acted on her promise. She ventured into the village again, this time to speak with the local magistrate. The man, Don Esteban, was known for his rigid adherence to social order, and Isabel could feel his skepticism the moment she entered his office. Señorita Isabel, he greeted, rising from his chair. To what do I owe the honor of your visit? I've come to speak about Matthew, she began, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Don Esteban raised an eyebrow, sitting back down. The boy accused of stealing your necklace? He didn't steal it, Isabel said firmly. I found it in my belongings yesterday. It was never lost. The magistrate's expression didn't change. And yet, the accusation stands. The villagers believe. I don't care what they believe, she interrupted, her voice stronger now. I'm telling you the truth. He saved my life, and I allowed them to tarnish his name. That was a mistake, and I need your help to correct it. Don Esteban studied her carefully, his fingers steepled under his chin. And what do you propose, señorita? I want a public announcement clearing his name, Isabel said, her tone unwavering. And I want to speak to the villagers myself. They need to hear the truth from me. The magistrate leaned back in his chair, considering her request. You understand the risk of this, don't you? By defending him so openly, you'll invite criticism. People may question your judgment, or your motives. Isabel straightened her back, determination shining in her eyes. Let them. I owe him this, and I won't let fear stop me. Later that day, a small crowd gathered in the village square, drawn by the news that Isabel had requested an audience. Matthew stood at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, his face unreadable. He hadn't been told what was happening, only that the magistrate had called for a meeting. When Isabel stepped forward, her heart pounded in her chest. She could feel every gaze fixed on her, but she pushed the nerves aside. Thank you all for coming, she began, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. I've called you here today because I need to correct a terrible mistake. Whispers rippled through the crowd, but Isabel didn't falter. Yesterday, many of you witnessed the accusations made against Matthew, she continued. And I said nothing. I let you believe he had stolen my necklace. But the truth is, the necklace was never lost. I found it later, exactly where I had left it. The crowd grew quiet, tension thick in the air. Matthew didn't take anything from me, Isabel said, her voice growing stronger. In fact, he risked his life to save mine. And instead of gratitude, I allowed him to be treated unjustly. For that, I am deeply sorry. Matthew's jaw tightened as he listened. Her words were unexpected, but there was no denying their sincerity. I ask you all, Isabel said, her gaze sweeping across the crowd, to look at him not as a thief, but as a hero. He deserves your respect, not your suspicion. The villagers murmured among themselves, their expressions shifting. Some looked ashamed, others skeptical, but the weight of Isabel's words was undeniable. As the crowd began to disperse, Isabel turned to Matthew, who had stayed rooted in place. She approached him cautiously, her heart hammering. I hope this is a start, she said softly, meeting his gaze. Matthew studied her for a moment before nodding. It's a start, he said, his voice quiet but firm. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, the first stone had been laid in the foundation of something neither of them could yet fully understand. Over the next few days, the air in the village shifted. Isabel's public declaration had set a ripple through San Isidro. Though some villagers still cast wary glances at Matthew, many had begun to question their quick judgment. The weight of Isabel's words carried influence, and slowly, the whispers about Matthew being a thief began to fade. For Matthew, however, the change wasn't immediate. The scars left by the accusations were still fresh, and while he appreciated Isabel's effort, he wasn't ready to completely trust her motives. One morning, as the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, Isabel ventured into the village again. This time, she carried a small basket filled with bread and preserves, a gesture of goodwill. She found Matthew near the carpenter's shed, helping mend a broken wheel. Good morning, she said, her voice light but carrying a hint of nervousness. Matthew looked up from his work, wiping his hands on a rag. His expression was unreadable. Morning, he replied simply. She stepped closer, holding out the basket. I brought this for your family. It's not much, but I thought. We don't need your pity, Matthew interrupted, his tone sharp. Isabel flinched, but she held her ground. It's not pity, she said firmly. It's a gift. And if you won't accept it for yourself, at least take it for your siblings. Matthew hesitated, his jaw tightening. He knew Sarah and Daniel would appreciate the gesture, and despite his pride, he reached for the basket. Thank you, he said gruffly, avoiding her gaze. She smiled faintly. You're welcome. A beat of silence passed between them before Isabel spoke again. Matthew, I meant what I said the other day. I want to help you. Not out of guilt, but because I believe in what's right. He met her eyes, searching for any trace of dishonesty, but all he saw was sincerity. You think standing in the square and talking to them changes everything? No, Isabel admitted. But it's a start. And if you let me, I want to do more. Matthew leaned back against the shed, crossing his arms. Why? What's in it for you? Her cheeks flushed, but she didn't waver. Because I owe you more than I can ever repay. And because I see how unfairly the world treats people like you. It's not right. Her words hung in the air, the honesty in them catching Matthew off guard. Before he could respond, Sarah and Daniel ran up, their faces bright with excitement. Isabel! Sarah exclaimed, recognizing her from the square. Did you bring this? Thank you. Daniel peeked into the basket, his eyes widening at the sight of the fresh bread. We never have bread like this. Matthew's shoulders relaxed slightly as he watched his siblings' joy. Isabel knelt to their level, smiling warmly. It's for all of you. I hope you enjoy it. The interaction softened something in Matthew, though he wasn't ready to admit it. "You've done enough for today," he said, his tone less harsh. "Thank you." Isabel stood, sensing the subtle shift in his demeanor. "I'll leave you to your work, then," she said, turning to go. But before she walked away, she added, "If you ever need anything, Matthew, you know where to find me." As she disappeared down the path, Sarah tugged on Matthew's sleeve. "She's nice," she said brightly. Matthew ruffled her hair, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "We'll see," he said quietly. That night, Matthew sat outside their small home, gazing up at the stars. His mind was restless, caught between doubt and the small flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, Isabel's intentions were genuine. At the estate, Isabel sat by the fire, writing in her journal. Her father had noticed her frequent visits to the village and had warned her against mingling with those people. But she felt more resolved than ever to challenge his worldview. Their lives, so different yet now intertwined, were beginning to shift in ways neither of them fully understood. And though the path ahead was uncertain, both Matthew and Isabel were starting to realize that change often begins with a single act of courage, and the willingness to take another step forward. As the weeks passed, the tentative understanding between Matthew and Isabel began to take root. Though their interactions remained infrequent and formal, Isabel continued to make small gestures, bringing supplies to the village, checking in on Matthew's family, and even engaging with the children who played in the dusty square. Her presence, once a source of gossip and suspicion, slowly became a sign of hope to many. Matthew, however, remained cautious. While he appreciated what Isabel was trying to do, a part of him still questioned her motives. Life had taught him that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, and her sudden interest in his well-being felt too good to be true. One late afternoon, Matthew was repairing a fishing net by the river when Isabel approached. The golden light of the setting sun reflected off the water, casting a soft glow over the scene. She carried a notebook and pen, her demeanor more determined than usual. "I need your help," she said, skipping any pleasantries. Matthew raised an eyebrow but didn't look up from his work. "With what?" She stepped closer, clutching the notebook tightly. "I want to understand how things really are for people here, for you and your family, for everyone in the village." Matthew's hands paused mid-knot as he looked up, his expression skeptical. "Why?" "Because I want to do more than just bring bread and say nice words," Isabel replied, her voice steady. "I want to make real changes. But to do that, I need to understand what you go through. What you need." Matthew studied her for a moment, searching for any hint of condescension or pity, but found none. Her sincerity was disarming. "And what happens after you understand?" "I don't know yet," Isabel admitted. "But I'll figure it out." After a long pause, Matthew set the net aside and gestured for her to sit on the rock beside him. "All right. Ask your questions." Isabel smiled, a flicker of relief crossing her face as she opened her notebook. "How often do you find work?" "Not often enough," Matthew said, his voice matter-of-fact. "Most days, it's whatever odd job I can find, loading carts, fixing things. It barely covers food, let alone anything else." She scribbled furiously, her pen moving quickly across the page. "And schooling? Do the children here have access to education?" Matthew let out a dry chuckle. "Schooling? Most kids can't afford to stop working long enough to learn anything. My brother and sister are lucky if they can read a few words I've taught them." Isabel's expression darkened as she jotted down more notes. The weight of his words was beginning to sink in, but she pressed on. "What about health care? If someone gets sick or injured?" "They get better," Matthew interrupted, his tone sharp. "Or they don't." Her hand froze mid-sentence, the bluntness of his reply cutting deeper than any statistic. The sun dipped lower in the sky as the conversation continued, touching on topics Isabel had never truly considered: the constant threat of hunger, the lack of clean water, the fear of losing even the little they had. Matthew spoke with a calm detachment, as though these struggles were as ordinary as breathing. When they finally fell into silence, Isabel looked up from her notebook, her expression heavy with thought. "How do you keep going?" she asked softly. Matthew glanced at the river, the light reflecting in his eyes. "Because I have to," he said simply. "For my family. For the people here. If I stop, who's going to fight for them?" Her chest tightened at his words. For the first time, she truly grasped the depth of his resilience, the quiet strength that kept him standing despite everything. "I don't know how to fix all of this," Isabel admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I promise you, Matthew, I'm going to try." He looked at her, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at his lips. "We'll see," he said, echoing the words he had spoken weeks before. As Isabel rose to leave, the notebook tucked under her arm, Matthew called after her. "Don't just try for me," he said. "Do it for them." She nodded, her determination renewed. "I will." The river continued its gentle flow as Isabel walked away, the setting sun casting long shadows on the ground. For the first time, Matthew felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, her actions could lead to something greater. And for Isabel, the conversations of that evening marked the beginning of a deeper purpose, one that would challenge not only the injustices of the world around her but the beliefs she had been raised to accept. The following days saw Isabel fully immerse herself in the life of the village. She visited homes, asked questions, and carefully documented what she learned in her notebook. Her fine dresses were replaced by simpler garments to avoid drawing attention, but her refined demeanor still set her apart. Despite the whispers and wary glances, she persisted, driven by a growing sense of responsibility. One morning, Isabel arrived at the modest schoolhouse near the edge of the village, a crumbling, one-room building barely large enough to hold the dozen children who gathered there. The teacher, an elderly woman named Donna Clara, greeted her with suspicion but allowed her inside when Isabel explained her purpose. The scene inside tugged at Isabel's heart. The children, ranging in age from 5 to 12, sat on mismatched chairs, their worn clothing and bare feet a testament to their struggles. The chalkboard was cracked, and the single shelf of books was nearly empty. Donna Clara gave her a tight smile. "We do the best we can, but it's not much," she said. Isabel nodded, taking in the sight of the children eagerly reciting their lessons. Despite their circumstances, there was a spark of determination in their eyes. As Isabel observed, she began to formulate an idea, one that would take time, resources, and effort but could truly make a difference. Later that day, she sought out Matthew. She found him near the carpenter's shed again, working alongside an older man to repair a wagon. His shirt was damp with sweat, and his hands were covered in sawdust, but his focus was unshaken. "Matthew," she called, standing a few steps away to avoid interrupting his work. He glanced up, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "You again," he said, though there was a faint note of amusement in his voice. "I need your help," Isabel said, stepping closer. He set down the hammer and crossed his arms. "You keep saying that. What is it this time?" "I want to rebuild the school," she said, her words spilling out in a rush. "Not just patch it up, I want to make it better. Bigger. A place where the children can truly learn, where they have books and supplies and a future." Matthew raised an eyebrow, skepticism flashing across his face. "That sounds ambitious." "It is," Isabel admitted. "But it's possible. I just need people to help me. Skilled workers, like you." He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "You think you can fix everything with one building? That a few books will change what these kids go through every day?" "No," Isabel said, her voice steady. "But it's a start. And sometimes, a start is all you need." Matthew studied her for a moment, his gaze probing. She had changed since their first encounter, her determination felt less like guilt and more like genuine purpose. "What's in it for you?" he asked finally. "Nothing," Isabel said simply. This isn't about me. It's about them. About your brother and sister, and the children I saw in that school today. Her honesty caught him off guard, and he found himself nodding before he even realized it. "All right," he said. "I'll help. But don't expect everyone to line up behind you just because you say it's for a good cause." "I wouldn't dream of it," Isabel said with a small smile. "Thank you, Matthew." Word of Isabel's plan spread quickly through the village. While some were skeptical of her intentions, others were cautiously hopeful. She began gathering supplies, using her family's wealth to purchase materials and tools. Her father, however, was less than supportive. "You're spending too much time in that village," he said one evening, his tone sharp. "This obsession of yours is unbecoming." "It's not an obsession," Isabel replied evenly. "It's a responsibility." Her father scoffed, his face hardening. "Your responsibility is to this family, to your name. Not to those people." "Those people saved my life," Isabel said, her voice rising. "And they deserve a chance to build their own." The tension between them grew, but Isabel refused to back down. Her resolve only strengthened as she returned to the village each day, coordinating the efforts to rebuild the school. Matthew became an integral part of the project, his skills in carpentry and repair proving invaluable. Despite his initial reluctance, he began to see the impact of their work, the way the children's eyes lit up when they saw the progress, the cautious optimism that spread among the villagers. One evening, as the framework of the new school stood tall against the setting sun, Matthew stood beside Isabel, surveying their progress. "It's coming together," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. "It is," Isabel agreed, her gaze fixed on the structure. "Thank you, Matthew. I couldn't have done this without you." He shrugged, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Maybe you're not as out of place here as I thought." The comment made Isabel laugh softly, and for the first time, Matthew felt a sense of camaraderie with her, a tentative but growing partnership that promised more than either of them had imagined. The school project became the heart of the village, drawing together people who had once hesitated to trust Isabel or even Matthew. With each passing day, the skeletal framework transformed into a sturdy building, its walls rising like a symbol of hope. Children often gathered around the site, their laughter filling the air as they watched the progress. Matthew worked tirelessly, his hands roughened from the constant labor. Isabel was always nearby, organizing supplies, consulting with Donna Clara about what the school needed, or even carrying planks of wood despite her lack of strength. The shared effort created an unspoken bond between them, though their conversations were often brief, filled with the easy rhythm of trust that had grown over time. One afternoon, Isabel arrived at the site carrying a bundle of books wrapped in cloth. She approached Matthew, who was hammering wooden panels onto the frame of a window. "Matthew," she called, her voice carrying over the sounds of construction. He glanced down, his forehead glistening with sweat. "What is it now?" he teased lightly. She held up the bundle with a triumphant smile. "Books. For the children. I found an old collection in the attic of the estate. They're dusty, but they're full of stories and lessons." Matthew climbed down the ladder, wiping his hands on his trousers before taking the bundle. He untied the cloth, flipping through the pages of a worn, leather-bound book. His fingers traced the faded letters with reverence. "These are good," he said simply, though there was a glint of approval in his eyes. Isabel grinned. "Do you think they'll like them?" "They'll love them," Matthew replied, glancing over at a group of children playing nearby. "They don't get much of a chance to read anything beyond what Donna Clara can scribble on that old chalkboard." Isabel hesitated, watching his face. "Did you ever get to read much as a child?" Matthew shook his head, his expression briefly clouding. "Not really. My mother taught me the basics, but books were a luxury we couldn't afford. I learned more by listening to stories and figuring things out on my own." Her chest tightened at his words, a familiar guilt creeping in. "That's going to change," she said softly. For all of them. Matthew looked at her, his expression softening. You're not like the others, he said after a moment. Is that a compliment? Isabel asked with a teasing smile. Maybe, he said, returning her smile faintly before turning back to the books. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the village, the work for the day began to wind down. Villagers lingered, chatting and admiring the progress. The walls of the school now stood firm, and the roof was nearly complete. It was no longer just a building, it was a symbol of what could be achieved when people worked together. Later, as Matthew walked home, Sarah and Daniel ran to meet him, their excitement contagious. Matthew! Sarah called, her small arms wrapping around his waist. Is it true? We're going to have a real school. Daniel's eyes were wide with wonder. Will there be desks? And books? Isabel told us about the books. Matthew knelt to their level, ruffling Daniel's hair with a smile. Yes, there'll be desks and books. And maybe even more if we keep working hard. Sarah beamed. I can't wait. I want to read everything. Matthew hugged them both tightly, the weight of his exhaustion fading in the face of their joy. Back at the estate, Isabel sat in the library, flipping through her own notebook. Her father entered, his presence casting a shadow over her work. You've been spending far too much time down there, he said coldly. Your duties here are being neglected. Isabel looked up, her eyes steady. I haven't neglected anything, father. And what I'm doing in the village matters. To them, perhaps, he said, his voice laced with disdain. But it does nothing for our family. You risk our name by mingling with people who will never see you as one of their own. They don't need to see me as one of them, Isabel replied, standing her ground. They just need a chance to build a better life. And I have the means to help. Her father's expression darkened, but he didn't argue further. Instead, he turned and left the room, leaving Isabel more determined than ever to prove him wrong. The night fell, quiet and calm, but within both Isabel and Matthew, a spark burned brighter than ever. They were two people from entirely different worlds, but they had found a shared purpose, a chance to rewrite the story of the village and, perhaps, their own lives as well. As the weeks passed, the school began to take its final shape. The villagers had come together in ways Isabel had never imagined. Men and women who once exchanged only cautious nods now worked side by side, hauling wood, mixing mortar, and painting the walls. Children pitched in as well, carrying small tools or fetching water, their laughter adding a light-hearted energy to the grueling work. For Matthew, the school had become more than just a building. It was a testament to resilience, a physical representation of what hope could accomplish. Yet, as much as he threw himself into the labor, he couldn't ignore the whispers that still lingered, whispers of doubt about Isabel's true intentions. One afternoon, as the sun hung high in the sky, Matthew found Isabel painting one of the school walls. Her once pristine hands were now speckled with white paint, her hair pulled back in a simple braid. She looked up when she noticed him approaching. Are you sure you're not royalty pretending to be a laborer? He teased, crossing his arms. She laughed, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. I've come a long way since thinking work like this was beneath me. Matthew leaned against the wall, watching her for a moment. Why are you really doing this, Isabel? And don't tell me it's just about helping the village. Her smile faltered, and she set the paintbrush down, turning to face him fully. Because it's about more than the village, she admitted. It's about proving to myself, and to others, that the world doesn't have to stay the way it is. That things can change if someone is willing to fight for it. Matthew considered her words, nodding slowly. And what happens when this is done? When the school is finished, and the villagers no longer need you? She hesitated, the weight of his question sinking in. Then I'll find another way to help, she said softly. This is just the beginning. Matthew didn't reply immediately. Instead, he picked up the paintbrush she'd set down and began helping her with the wall. You're stubborn, you know that. So I've been told, she said with a grin, the tension between them easing. As the day drew to a close, Isabel walked back to the estate alone, her thoughts heavy. She had spent so much time in the village that her world at home now felt foreign to her. The grand halls of the mansion seemed colder, the luxury she once took for granted now a constant reminder of the divide she was trying to bridge. Her father was waiting for her in the sitting room, a glass of brandy in hand. His stern expression told her everything she needed to know before he even spoke. Enough, he said firmly. You've played at this charity game long enough. It's time to stop. Isabel stood tall, refusing to be intimidated. This isn't a game, father. It's real, and it matters. To them, perhaps, he said, his voice clipped. But it's making you look foolish. And worse, it's tarnishing our reputation. If helping others makes me look foolish, then so be it, Isabel shot back, her voice steady. And if our reputation is more important to you than people's lives, then maybe it's our name that's the problem, not me. Her father's face darkened, his grip tightening on the glass. Be careful, Isabel. You're treading on dangerous ground. She met his gaze without flinching. I'm not afraid of losing what doesn't matter to me anymore. Their confrontation ended in silence, but Isabel's resolve only grew stronger. Meanwhile, in the village, Matthew sat with his family around a small fire outside their home. Sarah and Daniel chattered excitedly about the new school, their voices filled with hope for the future. Elena watched her son quietly, sensing the change in him. You're different, she said softly as the children ran off to play. Matthew looked at her, surprised. What do you mean? You carry yourself differently, Elena said. Like someone who's starting to believe the world can be better. Matthew smiled faintly, glancing toward the horizon where the school stood. Maybe I am, he admitted. The school was nearly complete, but for both Matthew and Isabel, it was clear that this journey was about more than bricks and mortar. It was about challenging the barriers between them and the lives they thought they were destined to live. And as the stars lit up the night sky, both of them felt, in their own way, that the story was far from over. The day finally arrived when the school was ready to open its doors. The building, once a fragile idea scribbled in Isabel's notebook, now stood tall and proud at the edge of the village. Its walls were painted a bright white, gleaming under the sun, and the roof was sturdy enough to withstand any storm. A small bell hung near the entrance, ready to call the children to their lessons for the first time. The villagers gathered outside, their faces a mix of curiosity and excitement. Children fidgeted in their best clothes, unable to contain their energy, while parents exchanged smiles filled with pride and gratitude. The air buzzed with anticipation, the kind that only comes when hope feels tangible. Matthew stood to the side, his arms crossed, observing the scene. His heart swelled with a sense of accomplishment he hadn't anticipated. He had poured his sweat and skill into this place, and seeing it come alive was more fulfilling than he could have imagined. Isabel arrived shortly after, her hands clutching a folded piece of paper. She wore a simple dress, her usual finery absent, blending into the crowd in a way that had become natural for her. When she saw Matthew, she walked over, her expression a mixture of nervousness and determination. Ready for the big moment, she asked, tilting her head toward the school. Matthew smirked. I think the kids are more ready than anyone else. She laughed softly, her gaze sweeping over the villagers. I wrote something to say before we officially open the school. Would you stand with me? Matthew raised an eyebrow. You don't need me for that. I do, Isabel insisted. You're as much a part of this as I am. Maybe more. He hesitated but eventually nodded. All right. Let's get this over with. As Isabel stepped forward, the crowd quieted. She cleared her throat, the piece of paper trembling slightly in her hands. Thank you all for being here today, she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. This school isn't just a building. It's a symbol of what we can accomplish when we come together, when we set aside our differences and work towards something greater. She paused, her eyes meeting Matthew's for a brief moment before continuing. This place belongs to all of you. To the children who will learn here, to the parents who dream of a brighter future for them, and to everyone who helped build it. It stands because of your strength, your resilience, and your belief that change is possible. The crowd murmured in agreement, a ripple of pride spreading through them. Isabel glanced at Matthew, silently inviting him to speak. He stepped forward reluctantly, his usual stoic demeanor softening as he addressed the villagers. "I never thought something like this could happen here," he admitted. "But seeing all of you come together to make it real, it proves we're stronger than we think. This school is just the beginning. If we can build this, who knows what else we can do." The crowd erupted into applause, the energy lifting the mood even higher. Isabel smiled, a wave of relief and joy washing over her. Donna Clara, the elderly teacher, stepped forward to ring the small bell. The children rushed inside, their laughter echoing through the open doors. Parents lingered outside, peeking in with awe at the desks, books, and supplies that filled the space. As the festivities wound down, Isabel and Matthew found themselves standing side by side again, watching the scene unfold. "You were good up there," Isabel said, nudging him playfully. "Don't get used to it," Matthew replied, though there was a glint of warmth in his eyes. She glanced at him, her expression serious. "You know this doesn't end here, right? There's still so much more to do." "I know," he said, his voice low but firm. "But for now, let's take a moment to appreciate this." Isabel nodded, her gaze returning to the school. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what they had achieved. And as the sun began to set over the village, its golden light spilling over the rooftops, the school stood as a beacon, a reminder that even the smallest spark of hope could light the way to a brighter future. The days following the school's opening were filled with a new kind of energy in the village. Children woke early, eager to run through the school's doors and claim their spots at the neatly arranged desks. The sound of their laughter and the ringing of the small bell became part of the village's rhythm, a melody of hope that hadn't existed before. Matthew watched from a distance most mornings, standing by the carpenter's shed as the children filed into the building. He wasn't used to the idea of slowing down, but he allowed himself small moments of pride when he saw Daniel and Sarah among the eager faces, their notebooks clutched tightly in their hands. One afternoon, as Matthew was repairing a broken fence near the river, Isabel arrived unexpectedly. She was holding a basket filled with bread, fruit, and a few bottles of lemonade. "Thought you might need a break," she said, setting the basket down on a nearby rock. Matthew looked up, his brow furrowed. "Do I look like I need one?" "You look like you haven't eaten since sunrise," she countered, crossing her arms. He smirked, setting down his tools and walking over. "Fine. I'll humor you." They sat in the shade of a tree, the sound of the river flowing softly beside them. Isabel poured lemonade into 2 glasses and handed one to Matthew, who accepted it without a word. "How's the school holding up?" he asked after a few moments. "It's better than I imagined," Isabel replied, her face lighting up. "Donna Clara told me the children are already learning faster than she expected. And Daniel, your brother, he's amazing. He helps the younger kids with their reading." Matthew's expression softened, pride flickering in his eyes. "He's always been quick. Sarah, too. They just needed a chance. And now they have one," Isabel said, her voice gentle. "Because of you." Matthew shook his head. "It's not just me. You made this happen, Isabel. You believed in it when no one else did." She smiled faintly, looking down at her hands. "I believed in it because of you. You showed me what this village is capable of, what the people here can achieve when someone gives them a little support." Matthew glanced at her, caught off guard by her sincerity. "You've changed a lot, you know," he said. She looked up, her gaze steady. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just becoming who I was always meant to be. The conversation drifted into a comfortable silence as they ate, the quiet punctuated by the rustle of leaves and the distant laughter of children. As they finished their meal, Isabel leaned back against the tree trunk, her expression turning thoughtful. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" she asked. Matthew raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "The school is finished," she said. "The village is thriving in a way it hasn't in years. But what's the next step? How do we make sure this lasts?" Matthew considered her words, his gaze fixed on the river. "It starts with the kids," he said finally. "They're the ones who'll shape what this place becomes. If we can give them the tools, the education, the confidence, they'll carry it forward." Isabel nodded, a spark of determination in her eyes. "Then we keep going. We find more ways to help them, to give them opportunities. Maybe even scholarships for the older ones, so they can study beyond the village." Matthew chuckled. "You don't do anything halfway, do you?" "Not when it matters," she replied with a grin. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the river, Isabel rose to her feet, brushing off her dress. "Thank you for letting me bother you," she said teasingly. Matthew stood as well, picking up his tools. "You're not as much of a bother as you used to be." She laughed, the sound light and genuine. "I'll take that as a compliment." As she walked back toward the village, Matthew watched her go, a strange sense of calm settling over him. Despite their differences, they had found common ground, and the partnership they had built felt unshakable. But deep in his heart, Matthew knew that the challenges weren't over. The world outside their village still loomed large, full of obstacles they had yet to face. And though neither of them said it aloud, both Matthew and Isabel understood that the work they had started was far from finished. The school was only the beginning. The days turned into weeks, and life in the village flourished around the school. The once quiet mornings now began with the sound of children running to class, their laughter echoing through the streets. The villagers' pride in what they had accomplished was evident in the way they walked with their heads held high, knowing they had built something extraordinary together. Isabel continued to spend her days between the school and the village, her focus now shifting toward finding ways to sustain what they had built. Books, supplies, and even teacher salaries required resources she couldn't endlessly provide alone. That realization led her to an idea she wasn't entirely sure would succeed but knew she had to try. One afternoon, as Matthew worked on repairing a broken cartwheel near the square, Isabel approached him with an envelope in her hand. "Do you have a moment?" she asked, her voice tinged with excitement. Matthew looked up, wiping grease from his hands. "What is it this time?" She handed him the envelope, and he opened it cautiously. Inside was a letter addressed to a foundation in the city, a group that funded education initiatives for underserved communities. "I wrote to them," Isabel said. "I explained everything about the school and the village. About what we've done and what we still need." Matthew scanned the letter, his brow furrowing. "You think they'll help us?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But it's worth a try. If they agree, it could mean a steady source of funding for the school. Enough for supplies, more books, even another teacher." He handed the letter back to her, his expression thoughtful. "It's a good idea. But what happens if they say no?" "Then we find another way," Isabel said firmly. "We've come this far, Matthew. I'm not about to stop now." Her determination brought a small smile to his face. "You're relentless, you know that." "I've been told," she said with a playful shrug. The following week, Isabel prepared to travel to the city to deliver the letter in person. The journey wasn't long, but it was significant, her first real step outside the sheltered world of the village and her estate since the school project began. On the morning of her departure, Matthew stood by as she loaded a small bag onto the wagon she'd arranged for the trip. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. "I've faced worse than a few city officials," Isabel replied, though there was a flicker of nerves beneath her confidence. Matthew nodded, his expression softening. Just don't forget where you came from when you're up there. And don't let them talk down to you. Her smile was warm and genuine. I could say the same to you if you ever left this village. He chuckled, stepping back as the driver climbed onto the wagon. Good luck, Isabel. Thank you, she said, her voice quiet but sincere. As the wagon pulled away, Isabel felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. The city loomed in the distance, its sprawling streets and towering buildings a stark contrast to the simplicity of the village. When she arrived, Isabel was immediately struck by the noise and energy of the place. Carriages clattered down cobblestone streets, vendors called out their wares, and well-dressed people hurried by, barely sparing her a glance. It was overwhelming, but she straightened her spine and pressed forward. The Foundation's office was an imposing building with high columns and polished floors. Isabel waited nervously in the reception area, clutching the letter as though it were a lifeline. When her name was finally called, she was led into a grand room where a panel of serious-looking individuals sat behind a long table. Miss Isabel de la Torre, one of them said, scanning her letter. We've read about your school project. It's quite an undertaking for someone of your background. Her jaw tightened at the implication, but she kept her voice steady. It's not just my project. It belongs to the people of my village. They've worked harder than anyone to make it a reality. The panel exchanged glances before the man in the center leaned forward. You're asking for a considerable amount of funding. What guarantees can you provide that it will be used effectively? I can't give guarantees, Isabel said honestly, meeting his gaze. But I can give you proof. Come to the village. See the school. Talk to the children and their families. Judge for yourselves if what we've built is worth your investment. The room fell silent, the panel clearly surprised by her directness. Finally, the man nodded. Very well. We'll send representatives next month to assess the project. Relief flooded Isabel's chest, though she kept her composure. Thank you, she said. You won't regret it. When Isabel returned to the village, Matthew was one of the first to greet her, his arms crossed as he waited by the square. Well? He asked as she climbed down from the wagon. They're sending representatives to see the school, she said, unable to keep the excitement from her voice. Matthew's smile was small but genuine. That's good news. You did it. We did it, Isabel corrected. As they stood there, the school bell rang in the distance, signaling the end of another day of lessons. Children poured out of the building, their laughter carrying on the wind. For a moment, both Isabel and Matthew simply watched, the future stretching before them like the first page of a new story. They weren't finished yet, not by a long shot. But for now, the progress they had made was enough to keep them moving forward, one step at a time. The news of the Foundation's impending visit spread quickly through the village. For many, it was a source of excitement and hope. For others, it sparked a cautious optimism tempered by years of unmet promises. Isabel threw herself into preparations, ensuring the school was ready to shine as the centerpiece of their progress. Matthew watched her from the sidelines, his admiration for her growing with each passing day. She had proven herself to the village in ways he hadn't expected, but he knew this upcoming visit would be her greatest challenge yet. A week before the Foundation's representatives were due to arrive, Isabel approached Matthew at the carpentry shed. He was sanding down a plank of wood for a repair project, his sleeves rolled up and his brow furrowed in concentration. Matthew, she began, her tone serious, I need to ask you something. He set down the sandpaper and leaned against the workbench, wiping his hands on a cloth. Go ahead. I want you to speak to them when they arrive, Isabel said, her voice steady but tinged with nervousness. Matthew's eyebrows shot up. Me? Why? Because you represent the heart of this village, Isabel replied. You've lived its struggles, and you've helped build its successes. No one knows better than you what this school means to us. He hesitated, the weight of her words settling over him. Isabel, I'm not good with speeches. That's your thing. It's not about a speech, she said, stepping closer. It's about telling them the truth. About showing them that what we've done here matters, not just to me, but to everyone. Matthew sighed, running a hand through his hair. All right, he said finally. I'll do it. But don't blame me if I scare them off. She laughed softly, relief washing over her face. You'll do fine. Thank you, Matthew. The day of the visit arrived, and the village hummed with activity. Families cleaned their homes, children rehearsed songs and recitations, and the school was polished until it gleamed. When the representative's carriage appeared at the edge of the square, a crowd had already gathered, their excitement palpable. 3 well-dressed individuals stepped out of the carriage, their sharp eyes taking in the scene. Isabel greeted them warmly, introducing herself and leading them toward the school. The children stood in neat rows outside, smiling and waving as the visitors approached. Inside, Isabel and Donna Clara gave a tour, highlighting the classroom's features, the desks built by villagers, the books Isabel had salvaged, the colorful drawings pinned to the walls. The representatives asked questions, their expressions thoughtful as they took notes. Finally, it was time for Matthew to speak. Isabel had prepared him as best as she could, but as he stepped forward, he felt a familiar wave of doubt. The representatives turned their attention to him, their faces expectant. I'm not one for fancy words, Matthew began, his voice steady despite his nerves. But I can tell you what this school has meant for us. For years, we've struggled to give our kids even the smallest chance at something better. Most of us grew up working from the moment we could walk, with no time to learn, no chance to dream. He paused, glancing at the children sitting in the classroom. This school is more than a building. It's hope. It's proof that things can change if we fight for it. And these kids, they're going to be the ones to carry that hope forward. The room was silent as he finished, the weight of his words hanging in the air. One of the representatives, a woman with kind eyes, smiled and nodded. Thank you, Mr. Matthew. Your perspective is invaluable. After the tour, the representatives mingled with the villagers, listening to their stories and witnessing the pride they felt in what they had accomplished. By the time they left, their carriage loaded with notes and impressions, the mood in the village was one of cautious celebration. Later that evening, Isabel found Matthew sitting outside his home, staring up at the stars. She sat beside him, the cool night air wrapping around them. You were incredible today, she said quietly. Matthew shrugged, but there was a hint of pride in his expression. I just told the truth. And that's why it mattered, Isabel replied. For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, the distant sounds of the village fading into the background. What happens if they don't approve the funding? Matthew asked eventually. Then we keep going, Isabel said without hesitation. We've come this far without them. We'll find another way. Matthew nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. You really don't give up, do you? Not when it's worth it, Isabel said, her voice soft but firm. As the stars twinkled above, both of them felt a sense of quiet accomplishment. No matter what the future held, they knew they had built something that would endure, a foundation of hope and determination that no amount of outside approval could take away. And though they didn't say it aloud, both Isabel and Matthew understood that their work together was far from over. The story they were writing wasn't just about the school or the village, it was about creating a legacy that would outlast them both. Weeks passed after the representative's visit, and life in the village settled back into its rhythm. The school continued to thrive, with children filling its halls each day, their laughter and determination a testament to the success of the project. Isabel and Matthew worked tirelessly, refusing to let uncertainty slow their progress. One afternoon, as Isabel returned from a meeting with Donna Clara, she spotted Matthew repairing the school's gate, which had been damaged by heavy rains the night before. She walked over, her expression light but purposeful. Still fixing everything, I see, she teased, crossing her arms as she stood beside him. Matthew looked up, smirking as he adjusted the gate's hinge. If it's broken, someone's got to fix it. Might as well be me. Always the hero, she quipped, though there was genuine admiration in her voice. Matthew stood, brushing off his hands. How did the meeting go? Good, Isabel said, her face lighting up. Donna Clara and I are organizing a celebration for the end of the school term. A little something for the children and their families. Matthew raised an eyebrow. A celebration? Yes, Isabel said firmly. To show them how far we've come and remind them of what we can achieve together. Matthew chuckled. You just want an excuse to make everyone dress up. She laughed, swatting his arm playfully. Maybe. But it'll be good for the village. You'll come, won't you? He hesitated for a moment before nodding. I'll be there. The day of the celebration arrived, and the village square was transformed. Lanterns hung from wooden posts, casting a warm glow over the crowd that had gathered. Long tables were set with food prepared by the villagers, a feast of simple yet hearty dishes that spoke of their shared efforts. The children performed songs they had learned in school, their voices carrying through the crisp evening air. Parents beamed with pride, their struggles momentarily forgotten as they celebrated what they had accomplished together. Isabel moved through the crowd, greeting everyone with warmth and gratitude. She wore a simple dress, her hair loosely tied back, blending seamlessly with the villagers who had come to see her as one of their own. Matthew lingered near the edge of the square, watching the festivities unfold. He was dressed in his best shirt, which still bore a faint tear from a long-ago day of work, but no one seemed to notice. Are you just going to stand there all night? Isabel's voice broke through his thoughts as she approached, a glass of lemonade in hand. I'm not much for parties, he admitted, though there was a faint smile on his lips. You helped make all of this possible, she said, gesturing to the bustling square. You should enjoy it. Matthew took the glass from her, his fingers brushing hers briefly. I am enjoying it, he said quietly. They stood together for a moment, watching as the children danced near the lanterns, their laughter infectious. You know, Isabel began, her tone thoughtful, this isn't just about the school anymore. It's about the future of the whole village. Matthew glanced at her, his expression serious. You're thinking big again. She smiled, her eyes bright. Someone has to. He chuckled softly. Just don't forget where it all started. I could never forget, Isabel said, her voice firm. It started with you, Matthew. With your courage and determination. He looked away, a faint flush coloring his cheeks. It wasn't just me. As the evening wore on, the celebration reached its peak. The villagers gathered around Isabel and Matthew, offering toasts and words of gratitude. For a brief moment, the weight of their shared struggles lifted, replaced by the joy of community and accomplishment. When the lanterns finally began to dim and the square quieted, Matthew and Isabel found themselves alone near the school. The air was cool, and the stars stretched endlessly above them. You've changed this place, Matthew said, his voice low but steady. So have you, Isabel replied, her gaze meeting his. More than you know. They stood in silence for a moment, the unspoken bond between them stronger than ever. Though the celebration was over, they both knew their journey was far from complete. This was only the beginning. The celebration marked a turning point in the village. For the first time in years, the air was filled with a sense of optimism that extended beyond the school. People began to dream again, of better opportunities, of brighter futures, of lives no longer defined by struggle. But with dreams came challenges. Isabel's letter to the foundation had yielded a promising response. They would provide partial funding for the school's ongoing needs, but only if the village could demonstrate its commitment by raising the remaining amount on its own. Isabel shared the news with Matthew one morning as he repaired a wheel outside the carpenter's shed. They're willing to help, she said, handing him the letter. But they want to see that we can help ourselves, too. Matthew read the letter, his brow furrowing. They want us to raise money. How much? Isabel hesitated. More than we've ever had at one time. But it's not impossible. He handed the letter back, crossing his arms. For a village like this, it might as well be. It's not just about the money, Isabel insisted. It's about showing them what we're capable of. If we come together like we did for the school, we can do this. Matthew sighed, his expression softening. All right. What's your plan? Over the next few days, Isabel and Matthew rallied the villagers, organizing fundraisers that ranged from small crafts markets to harvest festivals. Each event brought the community closer, their shared purpose reigniting the bonds they had built during the school's construction. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast golden light over the village, Isabel and Matthew sat outside the school, going over their progress. A ledger lay open between them, filled with numbers and notes. We're still short, Matthew said, running a hand through his hair. Even with everything we've done. I know, Isabel admitted, her voice tinged with frustration. But we're close. We just need one final push. Matthew leaned back, staring at the sky. There's a fair in the city next week. A big one. People come from all over to buy and sell. If we could sell something there. Isabel's eyes lit up. We could raise the rest of the money. Maybe, Matthew said cautiously. But what would we sell? And how would we get enough of it ready in time? For a moment, they sat in thoughtful silence. Then Isabel snapped her fingers. The village is full of skilled hands, woodworkers, bakers, weavers. We'll bring a little bit of everything. If everyone pitches in, we can do it. Matthew nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. All right. Let's try it. The week leading up to the city fair was a whirlwind of activity. Villagers worked late into the night, crafting wooden toys, baking bread and pastries, and weaving colorful fabrics. The school became a hub of creativity, with children helping where they could, their excitement infectious. When the day of the fair arrived, Isabel and Matthew stood in the village square, overseeing the loading of the cart that would carry their goods to the city. Everything ready? Matthew asked, tightening a rope around a crate. Almost, Isabel replied, her gaze sweeping over the bustling scene. This has to work, Matthew. It will, he said firmly, his confidence steadying her nerves. The journey to the city was long, but the fair's vibrant atmosphere greeted them like a warm embrace. Stalls lined the streets, offering everything from jewelry to livestock, and the air buzzed with the sounds of laughter and bargaining. Isabel and Matthew set up their stall, arranging the goods with care. Their handcrafted toys drew families, while the baked goods and fabrics attracted merchants looking for unique items. Slowly but steadily, coins began to fill their collection box. By midday, their stall was one of the busiest at the fair. Isabel worked tirelessly, greeting customers with a bright smile and explaining the story of the school to those who asked. Matthew handled the logistics, his calm efficiency keeping everything running smoothly. As the sun began to set, they counted their earnings together, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of the fair's lanterns. Did we make it? Isabel asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. Matthew added the last handful of coins to the pile and nodded. We did it. Relief and joy washed over Isabel, and without thinking, she threw her arms around Matthew in a spontaneous hug. He froze for a moment, surprised, before awkwardly patting her back. You're going soft on me, he teased, though there was warmth in his tone. She laughed, pulling away. I'm just happy, that's all. As they packed up their stall, the weight of their accomplishment began to sink in. They had not only reached their goal but also proved to themselves and the village that anything was possible when they worked together. That night, as they made their way back to the village under a canopy of stars, both Isabel and Matthew felt a quiet sense of triumph. The school was secure for the foreseeable future, and their shared journey had deepened the connection between them in ways neither of them fully understood yet. But they both knew this was only another chapter in a much larger story still waiting to be written. The journey back to the village was filled with a quiet satisfaction that neither Isabel nor Matthew could put into words. The cart creaked under the weight of their leftover goods and the box of coins they had worked so hard to earn. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth, and the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves against the dirt road provided a soothing backdrop to their thoughts. "Still can't believe we pulled it off," Matthew said, breaking the silence. He leaned back against the cart, his arms crossed as he gazed at the stars. "Neither can I," Isabel admitted, her voice light but tired. "I was so nervous this morning, I thought my hands would drop everything." Matthew chuckled. "You hid it well. Those city folks didn't stand a chance against your charm." Isabel smirked, nudging him with her elbow. "And your bargaining skills didn't hurt either. I've never seen anyone talk a merchant into paying double for bread." "Desperate times," he replied with a shrug, though there was a hint of pride in his tone. As the village lights came into view, a sense of accomplishment settled over them. The people of San Isidro had entrusted them with this task, and they had delivered. But as the cart rolled into the square, they were greeted by an unexpected sight. A small group of villagers had gathered, waiting for their return. The moment Isabel and Matthew stepped down from the cart, the crowd erupted into cheers. Children ran forward, their faces bright with excitement, while adults clapped and called out words of gratitude. "You did it!" Sarah exclaimed, throwing her arms around Matthew. "We knew you would." Daniel held up a hastily made banner that read, "Gracias," his grin stretching from ear to ear. Isabel felt her eyes sting with tears as Elena stepped forward, her warm smile carrying the weight of unspoken thanks. "You've given this village more than a school," Elena said softly. "You've given us hope." Matthew cleared his throat, his usual stoicism faltering under the weight of his emotions. "We couldn't have done it without all of you," he said, his voice steady but sincere. "This wasn't just us, it was everyone." Isabel nodded in agreement, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "The school belongs to all of us. And now, we can make sure it lasts for generations." The villagers broke into applause, their shared pride lighting up the square as brightly as the lanterns hanging overhead. Over the next few days, life in the village took on a celebratory tone. The funds from the fair allowed Isabel and Matthew to purchase much-needed supplies for the school, from new books to sturdy desks. The foundation's approval soon followed, cementing a partnership that would provide ongoing support for the village's educational efforts. One afternoon, Isabel stood in the schoolyard, watching as the children played a lively game of tag. Their laughter filled the air, a sound that had become her favorite part of the day. Matthew approached, carrying a freshly repaired chair for the classroom. "Looks like the kids are making good use of the place," he said, setting the chair down near the entrance. "They are," Isabel replied, smiling as she turned to face him. "And it's all thanks to you." He shook his head, leaning against the doorframe. "It's thanks to everyone. You more than anyone." For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, the weight of their shared journey evident in their expressions. "What's next?" Matthew asked finally, his tone half-teasing but also genuinely curious. Isabel's eyes sparkled with determination. "Next, we keep going. Scholarships, better resources, maybe even partnerships with schools in other towns. There's so much we can do." "You never stop, do you?" Matthew said with a faint smirk. "Not when there's still work to be done," Isabel replied. Matthew nodded, his respect for her unwavering. "Then I guess I'd better stick around. Someone has to keep you out of trouble." She laughed, the sound bright and genuine. "And someone has to make sure you don't overwork yourself." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the village, Isabel and Matthew stood side by side, their bond stronger than ever. Together, they had transformed more than just a building, they had reshaped a community, proving that change was possible when people believed in one another. And though neither of them knew what challenges lay ahead, they faced the future with the certainty that they wouldn't face it alone. With the foundation support secured and the school thriving, Isabel and Matthew shifted their focus to other needs in the village. Education had been a transformative first step, but the challenges of poverty, health, and limited opportunities still loomed. They both knew their work was far from over. One morning, Isabel called a meeting in the schoolyard. The villagers gathered, curious about her latest idea. She stood on a small wooden crate, her hands clasped tightly as she addressed the crowd. "We've built a school," she began, her voice steady and confident. "And it's already changing lives. But there's more we can do. If we want our children to thrive, we need to make sure they're healthy, that their families are supported, and that this village has the resources it deserves." The crowd murmured in agreement, though there was a trace of uncertainty in their faces. "Today, I want to talk about the river," Isabel continued, gesturing toward the distant waterway that had always been both a blessing and a challenge for San Isidro. "We rely on it for everything, our crops, our homes, our lives. But it's not always clean, and that puts us all at risk." Matthew, standing near the edge of the crowd, stepped forward. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice carrying a mix of curiosity and caution. "We build a filtration system," Isabel said, her eyes shining with determination. "Something simple but effective, so the water we use is safe. It'll take time and effort, but if we work together, we can make it happen." The villagers exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement while others whispered doubts. Elena, ever the voice of reason, stepped forward. "It's a big task, Isabel. Do you have a plan?" "I do," Isabel said confidently. "I've already reached out to an engineer in the city who's willing to help us design it. But we'll need materials and labor, and it won't be easy." Matthew crossed his arms, his gaze steady. "If we do this, it has to be done right. No shortcuts." "Agreed," Isabel said, meeting his eyes. The project began the following week. The engineer arrived, a gruff but kind man named Manuel, who quickly assessed the river and outlined the steps needed to create a simple yet effective filtration system. The villagers threw themselves into the work, digging trenches, assembling pipes, and constructing a small water station by the river's edge. Matthew led the physical labor, his strength and expertise invaluable in handling the heavier tasks. Isabel, meanwhile, coordinated efforts, ensuring everyone had what they needed and keeping spirits high when the work became grueling. One particularly hot afternoon, as Matthew and a group of men worked to secure the main pipe, Isabel arrived with a bucket of cool water and a tray of fruit. "You've been at it all day," she said, handing Matthew a cup. "Take a break before you collapse." He smirked, accepting the cup. "You sound like my mother." "Good," Isabel replied with a teasing smile. "Someone has to look after you." Matthew took a long drink, his expression softening. "This is harder than building the school," he admitted. "But it feels just as important." "It is," Isabel said, her voice quiet but firm. "Every step we take makes this village stronger." Matthew nodded, his respect for her growing with each passing day. "You've changed, Isabel. When I first met you, I thought you'd leave the moment things got tough." "And now?" she asked, tilting her head. "Now I know better," he said simply. Their conversation was interrupted by a shout from Manuel, who waved them over to inspect the completed section of the filtration system. Together, they hurried to the site, their shared determination driving them forward. Weeks later, the filtration system was complete. For the first time, the villagers had access to clean, safe water. The impact was immediate: fewer illnesses, healthier crops, and a renewed sense of pride in what they had accomplished. On the day the system was officially inaugurated, the entire village gathered by the river. Manuel demonstrated how the system worked, turning the once murky water into a clear, drinkable stream. The crowd erupted into cheers, their gratitude palpable. Isabel and Matthew stood side by side, watching as the villagers celebrated. "You've done it again," Matthew said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. "We've done it again," Isabel corrected, her eyes shining with emotion. As the sun set over the river, casting golden light across the water, they both felt the weight of their journey. The challenges they had faced had forged an unbreakable bond between them, one built on trust, respect, and a shared commitment to creating a better future. But deep down, both Isabel and Matthew knew there were still battles to fight, still dreams to pursue. Together, they would face whatever came next, armed with the knowledge that they could overcome anything as long as they stood united. The success of the water filtration system brought a wave of newfound energy to the village. Clean water transformed daily life, reducing illness and making everyday tasks easier. But for Isabel and Matthew, the victory was not a reason to rest, it was a call to keep moving forward. One evening, as the village gathered in the square for a small celebration, Isabel noticed Elena approaching her with a thoughtful expression. "You've done so much for us," Elena said, her voice warm but steady. "But there's something else we need to think about, something that's been a quiet problem for years." Isabel tilted her head, intrigued. "What is it, Elena?" "The roads," Elena replied. "They flood every rainy season, cutting us off from the nearby towns. It makes trade nearly impossible, and it isolates us when we need help the most." Matthew, who had been listening nearby, stepped forward. "She's right. We've gotten by with makeshift repairs, but it's not enough. If we're serious about the village's future, we need proper roads." Isabel nodded slowly, the weight of the issue settling over her. "Then that's what we'll do next." The project was daunting from the start. Building proper roads required more than just determination, it needed funding, materials, and expertise. But Isabel and Matthew had learned by now that no challenge was insurmountable when the village came together. The first step was to survey the land. Matthew led a small team of villagers to map out the most flood-prone areas, identifying where new drainage systems would be essential. Meanwhile, Isabel contacted Manuel, the engineer who had helped with the filtration system, seeking his advice. Manuel arrived a week later, his notebook in hand. "You two don't shy away from big ideas, do you?" he said with a smirk. "We've learned that big ideas are worth it," Isabel replied, a spark of determination in her eyes. Manuel spent days with Matthew and the team, marking out paths and calculating the materials needed. The villagers watched with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. This project was bigger than anything they had attempted before. The work began in earnest, with every able hand pitching in. Men and women dug trenches, laid stones, and hauled dirt, while the children carried water and supplies. The school became a temporary workshop, its yard filled with tools and piles of materials. One afternoon, as Matthew directed a group assembling a drainage channel, Isabel arrived with a wagon full of supplies. She hopped down, her boots sinking slightly into the damp ground. "You're getting good at this," she said, watching as he supervised the team. "Practice makes perfect," Matthew replied, though his expression was serious. "This isn't just about building a road. It's about making sure it lasts." "And it will," Isabel said confidently. "Because we won't settle for anything less." Matthew glanced at her, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "You've become just as stubborn as me." "Maybe you're rubbing off on me," she teased. The days stretched into weeks, and progress was slow but steady. The villagers' resilience was tested as they faced challenges, unexpected storms, broken tools, and the sheer physical toll of the work. But Isabel and Matthew were always there, rallying spirits and finding solutions. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Matthew sat with Sarah and Daniel near the partially completed road. The siblings listened intently as he explained how the drainage system worked, their faces alight with curiosity. "Will the roads really make things better?" Daniel asked, his voice filled with hope. "They will," Matthew assured him. "They'll make it easier for us to trade, to travel, and to bring new opportunities here. And for us to visit other places? Sarah chimed in, her eyes wide with excitement. Matthew smiled, ruffling her hair. Maybe one day. The project culminated in a celebration that rivaled the school's inauguration. The new roads, sturdy and well-constructed, stretched from the heart of the village to the nearby towns, connecting San Isidro to the wider world for the first time in years. As the villagers gathered to mark the occasion, Isabel stood at the edge of the road, her heart swelling with pride. Matthew joined her, his expression unreadable as he gazed at the completed work. "You did it again," he said finally. "We did it," Isabel corrected, a familiar warmth in her tone. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their accomplishments settling over them. The roads weren't just pathways, they were lifelines, symbols of progress and hope that would carry the village forward. "What's next?" Matthew asked, his voice tinged with a mix of exhaustion and curiosity. Isabel laughed softly, her eyes sparkling. "I haven't decided yet. But whatever it is, I know we'll figure it out together." Matthew nodded, his trust in her evident. Together. As the villagers celebrated around them, Isabel and Matthew shared a quiet moment of understanding. They had come so far, not just as leaders of a community but as partners in a journey that had changed them both. And though they couldn't see the future, they knew one thing for certain: whatever lay ahead, they would face it side by side. With the new roads in place, San Isidro began to experience a transformation that went beyond its borders. Merchants from nearby towns started visiting the village, bringing goods that had once been scarce and opening opportunities for trade. The villagers, proud of their hard work, began selling their crafts, produce, and textiles to outsiders, creating a sense of prosperity that had once seemed impossible. Isabel and Matthew watched the changes unfold with a mix of pride and cautious optimism. They had achieved so much, but both knew that progress came with its own set of challenges. One morning, Isabel was at the school, helping Dona Clara organize a shipment of new supplies. The children buzzed with excitement as they unpacked books, pencils, and maps sent by the foundation. As Isabel handed a globe to a wide-eyed Daniel, Matthew appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame, his arms crossed, a familiar smirk on his face. "You've turned this place into a hub of activity," he said. "Just keeping up with the demands of progress," Isabel replied with a smile. "What brings you here?" "Something's come up," Matthew said, his tone turning serious. "I think we need to talk." They walked to the edge of the village, where the new road met the fields that stretched toward the horizon. The air was cool, the morning sun casting a golden light over the landscape. Matthew gestured toward the fields, where workers tended to the crops. "We've made the village stronger, no doubt about that. But with more people coming through, we're starting to see some problems." Isabel's brow furrowed. "What kind of problems?" "Disputes over land," Matthew explained. "Merchants offering to buy plots, villagers disagreeing over boundaries. It's creating tension." Isabel frowned, the weight of his words sinking in. "I didn't realize it had gotten so serious." "It's not out of control yet," Matthew said. "But it could be if we don't address it." Isabel nodded, her mind already racing with ideas. "We'll need to establish clear boundaries and agreements, something official that everyone can rely on." "Like what?" Matthew asked, his skepticism evident. "A council," Isabel said after a moment. "Made up of villagers, elected by the people. They can handle disputes, manage resources, and make decisions that benefit everyone." Matthew tilted his head, considering her proposal. "You think they'll go for it?" "They trust you, Matthew," Isabel said. "If you support it, they will too." Matthew sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" "Not a chance," Isabel replied, a glint of determination in her eyes. The idea of a village council was met with mixed reactions at first. Some villagers were excited about the prospect of having a formal system to address issues, while others were wary of change. Isabel and Matthew held several meetings, explaining the concept and encouraging open discussion. During one particularly heated meeting in the schoolyard, an older villager named Don Ignacio stood up. "We've managed just fine without a council all these years," he said gruffly. "Why complicate things now?" "Because things have changed," Matthew replied, his voice calm but firm. "We're no longer the isolated village we used to be. If we don't adapt, we risk losing everything we've built." Don Ignacio huffed but didn't argue further. Isabel seized the moment, stepping forward to address the crowd. "This isn't about taking power away from anyone," she said. "It's about giving everyone a voice and protecting what we've worked so hard to achieve." Her words resonated, and by the end of the meeting, the villagers agreed to a trial period for the council. Elections were held the following week, with Matthew nominated as one of its first members. The council quickly proved its worth. Land disputes were resolved fairly, and plans were put in place to manage the village's growing trade and resources. For the first time, the villagers had a system that empowered them to take control of their future. One evening, as the sun set over the fields, Isabel and Matthew sat on the steps of the school, watching the village lights flicker to life. "You did it again," Matthew said, his tone teasing but warm. "We did it," Isabel corrected with a grin. Matthew chuckled, shaking his head. "You always say that." "Because it's true," she replied, her voice softening. "None of this would have happened without you." He looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "And none of it would have happened without you." For a moment, they sat in silence, the bond between them unspoken but undeniable. As the stars began to dot the sky, Matthew broke the quiet. "So, what's next on your list of big ideas?" Isabel smiled, leaning back against the steps. "I have a few thoughts. But for tonight, let's just enjoy this." Matthew nodded, his usual stoicism giving way to a rare moment of peace. And as the village buzzed with the quiet hum of progress, they both knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. The following months brought a sense of balance to San Isidro. The newly formed council began operating smoothly, and the village thrived with its newfound sense of structure and community. The roads brought steady trade, the school continued to inspire young minds, and the filtration system ensured clean water for all. Yet, amidst the progress, a quiet realization settled over Isabel and Matthew: change was inevitable, and not just for the village but for themselves as well. One late afternoon, Isabel found herself walking along the riverbank, the place where her journey with Matthew had begun. The water sparkled under the sun, and the gentle sound of its flow was both calming and nostalgic. She stopped at the exact spot where he had saved her life, her heart heavy with the memories of how far they had come. "Thinking about something?" Matthew's voice broke through her thoughts. She turned to see him standing a few steps behind her, his hands in his pockets and his expression unreadable. "Just everything," she admitted with a small smile. "How much has changed? How much we've built together." Matthew stepped closer, his gaze drifting to the river. "It's strange, isn't it? To look back and realize how different things are now." Isabel nodded, her eyes distant. "Sometimes, I wonder if it's enough. If what we've done will last." "It will," Matthew said firmly, his voice steady. "Because it's not just about the buildings or the systems. It's about the people. You've given them something they never had before, belief in themselves." "And you've done the same," Isabel replied, her voice soft but certain. "You've shown them what it means to lead with strength and kindness." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared accomplishments pressing against the unspoken question lingering between them: what came next? "I've been thinking," Isabel said finally, her tone hesitant but resolute. "About the city." Matthew frowned slightly, his focus shifting to her. "What about it?" "There are other villages like San Isidro," she said, turning to face him fully. "Places that need help, just like we did. I want to take what we've learned here and use it to make a difference elsewhere." Matthew's expression remained unreadable, though a flicker of something crossed his eyes, pride, perhaps, or the ache of knowing what her words implied. "You're leaving," he said quietly. "Not forever," Isabel said quickly. "But I can't ignore the opportunity to do more. This village will always be my home, Matthew. But I think it's time for me to see what else is out there." Matthew looked away, his jaw tightening. "You've done more than enough here. No one would blame you for wanting to do more elsewhere." She stepped closer, her voice softening. "I'll miss this place. I'll miss you." Matthew finally met her gaze, his eyes reflecting a mixture of emotions he didn't quite know how to express. "You'll be back," he said simply. "I will," Isabel promised. "And when I do, I want to see this village stronger than ever. I know it will be, because you're here." Matthew nodded, his expression softening. "You'd better keep your word." She smiled, a hint of tears in her eyes. "You know I will." The day Isabel left, the entire village gathered in the square to see her off. Children hugged her tightly, their eyes filled with admiration and gratitude. Parents thanked her for the countless ways she had changed their lives. The council presented her with a beautifully carved plaque, a token of their appreciation for her leadership and vision. Matthew stood at the edge of the crowd, his usual stoicism masking the quiet ache in his chest. When the goodbyes were said and the wagon began to roll down the road, he caught Isabel's eye one last time. "Take care of them," she called out, her voice carrying over the distance. "I always do," Matthew replied, his voice steady but warm. As the wagon disappeared from view, the village slowly returned to its routines. Life went on, as it always did, but something had undeniably shifted. Months later, letters began arriving in San Isidro, updates from Isabel about the work she was doing in other villages. Each one was filled with stories of new challenges and successes, but they always ended the same way. "No matter where I go, San Isidro will always be my home. And you, Matthew, will always be a part of it. Keep leading, keep building, and never stop dreaming. I'll see you soon." Matthew read each letter carefully, his quiet smile growing with every word. He could feel her determination in the ink and her unwavering belief in him in the way she wrote his name. And though she was miles away, her presence remained in every corner of the village, in the school, the roads, the water, and the hearts of the people she had inspired. For Matthew, the work continued, the fire of their shared vision burning brighter than ever. He knew she would return one day, and when she did, San Isidro would be ready to welcome her back with open arms. Because the story they had written together was far from over. It was only just beginning.